Let me go ahead and talk about how to deploy. Harking back to what I did the other day when Paul was kind of sitting on the sidelines, shaking his head, no, don't do this to me, Ali. And I said, I've got to go to a client meeting. I don't care if you don't know how to do it. Here you go. I hear that it didn't go very well. Surprise, surprise. So I'm going to walk you through what I should have walked through that afternoon had I had more time. So we left off with you all having come through. Were we doing Google Cloud or were we doing AWS that day? AWS, okay.
Can you make it a little bit bigger for us?
Sure.
Awesome, thank you.
Okay, so AWS, the other day, hopefully you turned off your instance. If not, you're still within your free period, so you haven't lost anything. But you don't want to leave it on indefinitely, so if you have these cloud resources running, it's exactly the same as having your light switch turned on or your fan turned on, and it just always running. So be sure to, this is how you turn it off. Right-click, instance state, stop, okay? And as a matter of fact, that is the Linux instance that I hosted our Node.js API voting thing on. I'm going to stop it right now. And AWS has added a lot more modals over the years to help people that are new to the service so they know you're about to turn off your server. Are you sure? Yeah, I know what I'm doing. So we just turned off our API voting server, which means our API voting endpoints will no longer be available. So if you all wanted me to turn that on or give you the code, actually you have the code. You have the repo for it. So you know how to deploy it to AWS. You just have to start up a Linux instance. If any of you, by the way, are interested in deploying a Linux-based application to the cloud, we have not covered that at all. We've covered, and I'm covering here, how to deploy Windows stuff to the cloud. Linux is actually easier. But since we haven't gone through the process of finishing a Linux-based application like Elixir, Ruby, or even .NET Core if you want to host on Linux these days, I have not shown you how to deploy that, set up a Ubuntu instance in the cloud, but it's very, very easy. And it's cheaper. So it's about 3/4 the cost of a Windows instance per hour. So that takes its sweet time to stop, but we don't really care. Now, when it stops, one little thing about AWS, it's not deleted. So stop means they're not charging you for the computing runtime. They've saved all of your data to disk, so what's the equivalent of like your C drive is still there. As a matter of fact, if you go over here to volumes, you're going to see one attached to each one of the primary instances. Since I only have one drive per server, you see 3 of these. So, and if we looked into the instance details, you'd see the volume ID specific to that instance. So that's how these relate. It says it's in use, even though that instance is stopped. That means that they're charging you for hosting these 30 gigabytes of data that is your hard drive. But they're not charging you, which is much more expensive per hour, for your EC2 instance stuff. So, like this, you can leave it like that for a year. You're not going to get any charges, okay? If you really don't need it, delete it. And the way you do that is don't delete the volume directly. You would go to the instance. You would find the instance you want to delete, and it's called terminate. You do that. So if I did that, it would deallocate this instance. It will stick around for about half an hour, and it'll say terminated, and then it'll eventually disappear, which was kind of confusing the first time. It's like, I really wanted to delete it. It sticks around for a little while, but it's going to go away. It's irretrievable after that point. There's going to be 2 or 3 pop-ups if I chose terminate. Usually, if I'm never going to use it again, or if I screwed it up and I'm going to rebuild it from scratch, start fresh, I would just terminate something, start fresh, new instance, fresh image. So, for your purposes, if you're done playing in AWS, terminate your instances. That will remove this. It will also delete your volumes. We haven't seen it because we didn't need to, and this really wasn't a cloud engineering focus class. We just showed you the basics. There's this thing called snapshots. Snapshots is a backup. So you can take a snapshot of your hard disk anytime you want, whether it's running or not running. and that's a good idea. So oftentimes, if it's a real production account, what I'll do is I'll instantiate. I'll spend half an hour, 2 or 3 hours building, meaning installing all the software, configuring it exactly the way I want to, and then I'll take a snapshot. And then I can terminate if I want, because I can, with a snapshot, I can get back to that point. And next time, I won't have to install that stuff again. Unfortunately, versions of software change like every 2 weeks, so you end up, it doesn't save you a whole lot of time. I'm going to have to reinstall everything fresh next time anyway. So that's what a snapshot is. Anybody remember what an elastic IP is?
It can change.
So Aaron says it can change. What does that mean?
Dynamic.
It's flexible. It's dynamic. In the real world, outside of AWS, what are elastic IPs called? Static IPs. Static IPs. So a static IP is not the terminology they use at AWS, because you can take your static IP and it's not really assigned to a specific MAC address, a specific piece of hardware. It's elastic in the sense that you can reallocate it to another server. Important point, the reason I'm going over this again, not to just remind you, but if something is unallocated, like right now, so associate, dissociate, I don't think we have anything associated that we're running. Those are all stopped. I learned this the hard way, and it's not a big deal, it's not painful, but it does kind of bother me because I'm a cheapskate sometimes, is if you have an elastic IP address that is unallocated, they charge you $2, $2.50 per month for the right to hold an unallocated IP address. A little gotcha. So, if you're not using your elastic IP and you're never going to use it again, because if you deallocate this and release it, watch this. Dissociate, what does that mean in this context? What did I just do?
It sends the IP address back to them to reuse.
No, that's the second step. So Brian said it sends the IP address back for them to use. No. Dissociate means I'm going to unallocate this IP from that instance. Notice it's still here. If I want to allocate it back, I can associate it back. But this IP address is still mine. They're still charging me for it. I don't really care about either one of these, so what I'm going to do is this. Dissociate. Now, there are 2 steps. Dissociate means the instance associated is no longer there, but I still have these IPs. These are my static IPs that I've reserved. To eliminate them and release them back to Amazon, and they cannot charge me for them anymore, select them and release. And it says, are you sure? Because after you do this step, you're never getting them back. Okay? They're no longer yours. So if you set up DNS that point to these static IP addresses, you got to go redo that with new static IPs, and you might have some downtime. So before you do this, know what you're doing. Kiss these goodbye. They're gone. Okay? Good news is they're not going to charge us for it anymore. Now, you may wonder, we had these elastic IPs associated to these instances. That mean we can't run these anymore? No. It will revert to automatically generated IP addresses given to you. Well, it says public DNS IPv4. It's blank right now because it stopped. The next time I start this, and I'm not going to start this one, I'm going to actually do it over on Google Cloud, but I'm in AWS to show you this is how you go and restart your instance. As soon as I were to start that, I would have a new public DNS IPv4. And that's the IP address you could use. Is that an ephemeral or a static IP by default? Ephemeral. So it'll work while you're testing. And until you turn it off, you'll keep that IP address. But if you don't associate an elastic IP address, otherwise known as a static IP address, you're not going to be guaranteed to have the same IP, which means you should never associate DNS to an ephemeral because you're causing problems for yourself. It's going to change, and you're going to be surprised. It's like, why has everything stopped working randomly? Well, you rebooted your server, you got a new IP address. That's why you have elastic IPs. So, over here in Google Cloud, let's see, we've got an external IP. So I just switched cloud providers. Sorry about that. So I was over there, I had both of these open. You should have an Azure account, Google Cloud account, and AWS account, all 3. So we started on AWS the other day, and we built a Windows server, And because I was finishing up the documentation that I shared with you in the announcements or the Empower Public channel a few minutes ago, I actually finished up the documentation on Google Cloud to make sure I could give you that in case you want to go with Google in the future rather than AWS or vice versa. So you have two options. It is exactly the same, except how you get there is a little bit different. So in Google Cloud, when you create a new instance, you build it. Have we gone through this? Like for Google Cloud?
No.
No? Okay. It'll take a few minutes. Let me go. I'm not going to actually commit it, but I'll show you. So we're going to pretend like these things don't exist. Create instance. By the way, where am I? I'm under Compute Engine VM Instances. That's where I am in Google Cloud. So you give it a name. Okay. Looks like Google has a South Carolina data center. And I'm going to use Northern Virginia because I'm not going to trust South Carolina. And we're going to go to defaults are fine. Now, why am I getting $27.78 per month? Because I've already used up my allocation for my free tier. I've already got 2 or 3 servers, and it's like, okay, there's a limit, guy. We're not going to give you everything for free. If I had none running, then I could easily choose another. Now here, your boot disk, this is where you select your operating system. And why is it only showing me? It only wants to show me Linux, which is kind of weird. Normally, you've got maybe I have to do this. Windows Server. Okay. Yeah, I guess they're really promoting Linux. Windows isn't even on their default list. So let's go with this. Quite a bit more expensive, eh?
Why is it so much more expensive?
Windows licensing. The question is, why is it so much more expensive? And that's a lot. Between this and going with AWS, AWS will charge you $20, $25 a month. So for Windows, I would go with AWS or Azure. You know, Azure is probably going to give you the best price because it's their operating system. They can probably cut you some deals. Now, in AWS, we set up security groups. They try to simplify things a lot more in Google Cloud, which is good and bad. It's good because the default behavior, okay, I really am probably setting up a web server. I probably want to let HTTP traffic and HTTPS traffic through. They kind of dumb it down a little bit for the non-technical people to be able to say, like, I want that and that. In reality, what are they doing here? What's the equivalent? HTTP and HTTPS. What ports are those?
340.
It's there are 2 ports. So they're configuring their firewall to allow port 80 and port 443, which is HTTPS, through, just by checking a box. Now, if you want to get more specific, you can, but they try to make it easy. So we would do that, create. It would take a while to boot, and at the end, it doesn't take as long actually on Google Cloud. I don't know what they do, but it is quicker. So once we were to do that, we would come over here. When you have the green background with a white check, we would be able to do this. Or you want that to go away. Okay, you're going to have a little drop down here. You remember how hard it was with AWS where you actually had to wait a while, you had to get your Windows password, then you had to go through and configure MSTSC, which is Remote Desktop Client? Well, you don't have to do that. Here, it's like, if you forgot your Windows password, just set it again. Set it to whatever you want. And here, you want an RDP file? You can click there. Otherwise, just copy the IP address, MSTSC, and connect. And I've already done that. I'm actually logged in. That's what this is. So this is the server out there. Okay? So this is after and notice the IP address. MSTSC, I've remoted in. I'm on the desktop of our server. So does anybody remember what the Windows included web server software is? IIS. What does IIS stand for? Internet Information Server. Very good. So where do we get it? If you don't have it pinned down there, INET MGR. And you run it once. And then what I always do on a web server is I'll pin it, because that's pretty much all you do on a web server. And let's go over the architecture of IIS really quickly. So by default, this is going to be named after your server. So there's one IIS service process. By the way, on day one, we covered some of the Windows utilities. And I covered that not because I liked wasting my breath, but I covered it because those are the underpinnings of a lot of the things we've learned about. How does SQL Server run? Like, I'm not talking about SQL Server Management Studio. I'm talking about SQL Server. How does that run? What form? How is it always there for you?
It's a service.
It's a process, but how is that process running? What type of process is it? We talked about it. I know day one was a blur, and that was 8 weeks ago. And I'm asking you to remember like 2 minutes of 8 weeks ago when you were probably stressed of your first day in this crazy thing we're doing. It's a Windows service. Windows service. So, IIS, likewise, is a Windows service. Windows services have the characteristic of what? They can always be running, all the time. They can be running before you log in. And you can do whatever you want inside a Windows service. So the reason I mention that is because I'm trying to remind you of, there was a reason on day one. I didn't expect you all to remember that. But there's a reason I mentioned it. And in the interviews I said, I want you to remember 60, 70, 80%. Obviously, that wasn't one of the 60, 70, or 80%. But it's important. Everything we covered is really important. Some more than others. Windows services are things that are always running. How do you go and see your services? Do you remember that? Services.msc, and these are all the services installed on my computer, whether or not they're running. How do I tell if they're running? Status. And if there's nothing in there, it's not running. It's running, there it is. And how do you tell it, I want you to automatically run, or I want to start it manually? It's the startup types. You right-click, properties, startup type. You got those options. Automatic means as soon as you turn on your computer, even before you log in, you're going to run. Why do we care about this? Because y'all have become pretty good, and you're getting better every day, about debugging your own problems. A lot of the problems you have as a developer have nothing to do with your code. Unfortunately, that's life. You got to figure out other people's problems. You got to figure out why it didn't install, why this horrible component that you really need isn't working. Right, Melissa?
Yes.
And you've got to figure it out. It's not your problem, but you have to debug the error messages. As Harper's been talking about, find what the error message is trying to say to you. Sometimes it's going to be that SQL Server has not been installed properly, or it's not even in the code. So I'm looking for SQL Server on here, and it's not there. If I do the same thing locally, does anybody know the name of the SQL Server service? SQL Server. What's the parens here mean?
It's what you downloaded.
Version.
No, that's what we named it.
What we named it. SQL Server has instances. So I've actually got just two different instances of SQL Server on this machine. Two completely separate Windows services. Two different versions. They run side by side. They don't know about each other at all. That's not normal. That's because this is a developer computer. So if I wanted to stop SQL Server, you don't believe me, watch this. And this is kind of a tangent, and this is not, it's not random. I'm actually buying somebody some time. So SQL Server, connect to this. Bang. I'm in. Now watch this. You see how it's running? I can stop the Windows service. So are you sure? Yeah, I'm sure. Now, it's smart enough that it automatically detected that it's down. So I'm going to get all kinds of errors now. The point is that SQL Server Management Studio is a window onto what is really going on out there. Can SQL Server Management Studio connect only to your local computer? No. It can talk to any Windows service in the world that you have access to. What port does it talk over? SQL Server. 1433. Okay. So I'm going to start this back, and everything's going to be right with the world again. The reason I mention this, it's not a complete tangent, is because IIS is, oh, see, it's back now. So we're happy. So IIS, let's go back to our server. Also runs as a Windows service. It's just out there all the time. So the reason I'm mentioning that is because there's one IIS service per server if it's been installed and configured. Can you host multiple websites on a given IIS server? Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes, you can. How do you do that? How does IIS know that you want this website versus that website?
Domain.
What's the technical term? You're right. So it inspects the URL that's being requested. And let's go look at this. It's under bindings. So what does this mean? Hostname means that's the URL that was requested. Port 80. Can you run on any port?
As long as it's not already being...
That's the right answer. So that was a trick question, and you passed. You can run on any unused port. Remember, it's like a TV station, TV channel. You can't have two programs running on the same TV channel at the same time and make sense of them. Same thing with internet traffic. You've got a port, that's like a channel. If somebody's talking on that port, it's used. You can't have it. So if I wanted to give this a DNS, remember on day, was it day one that we created a DNS entry and we bought it on the internet?
Yes.
Yeah. If I were y'all, I would have been scared to death. It's like, okay, on day one, we bought a DNS and associated to a public IP. Yeah. Congratulations for making it through.
Scaffolds were that space.
So you have a DNS out there, and we associated it. Do you remember what the AWS service that we used to be able to associate a DNS to an IP was?
It was an S3 bucket.
S3 bucket is where we put our files. That's just blob storage. What does blob stand for? Binary large object. So it means big files. Big files of whatever. So, not 55, not 52, 53. You got it, you would have found it. The good news is that I'm revisiting this because this is all relevant to hosting your IIS server. So if we wanted to, we can actually do this. These are subdomains where it says Vote API. And I think I killed that just now. So what we're going to do is we're going to route to there. So we're using AWS Route 53 to route our empower2018.us site. We're going to give it a different IP. So what I did is I said, I'm going to go edit this one, Vote API. It's kind of a, I don't want to do that. I'm going to add another one. So let's do create record set. And this is going to be core app. Okay. So core app.empower2018.us is going to go to this IP address. That's all I said there. And if I go there, it can't be reached because server IP address cannot be found. Oh, wait a minute. I figured it out. What is that? That is a .NET Core app running on the internet that we built. It's running on this server. And it's being served here. So let me show you how we did that. Bindings. Now I can do this. It worked because default on, I turned off all the other ports and I said, I want you to serve this website, nasty web application 2, on everything that's coming here. I don't care what URL they ask for. The binding, the host name is blank. Everything on port 80. So anything anybody ever requests that comes to this IP, give them this. That's what that says. If I say blank here. Now I'm going to make it more specific. Okay? I'm going to say if they request that, then that's the only time I want to respond. And we can remove this one. So what I've done is I've changed the bindings for this site to be that specific URL. So this is how you can host 100, 200 different sites, as long as they're little nothing sites or you have a powerful enough server, on the same IIS server. I wouldn't advise it, probably maybe 10, depending on what they're doing. Each of them have a different host name. That is all you have to do to tell IIS. When somebody asks for this URL, send them here. Where's the directory? Does anybody remember how we told it where our files were? It's under Basic Settings. You just give it a physical path. So I showed you the first part where we built and compiled our application. We'll do that again in a minute. I published it to a temp directory, and then we connected through RDP, and we can copy and paste from our local published directory over here. Where are we going to put it? In this path, right there. C, inetpub, www.root, whatever you want. Let's go look at what that looks like. So C, inetpub, www.root, core1, name it whatever you like. These are all the files that were given to me. Harper's texting, hold on. Apparently Harper and Balance are chatting, and I don't need to be concerned with it. So, notice the web config. Remember the app settings.json that Paul taught you about? Right there it is. There's www.root. That's it. That's a core app deployed. I wish there were more to wow you with IIS, but that's it. IIS is pretty straightforward, especially if you're only deploying 1 or 2 sites. So that's it. Notice I stopped this website. I could actually start it back if I want. I stopped it because both the default website and Core 1 had no host name listen on port 80. And that's not going to work because then they're both trying to be the default website for anybody who comes and asks for something. So how do I make sure that that's right? Be careful, it's context sensitive, so you got to select this over here on the left, and then all the buttons relate to that one. Host name is blank. So you see how the little black square is over there? You can right click, over here, click start, my bad. So if we go directly to this IP address, are we going to get a different result from going to our named site? So this is resolving to the same IP address. So 35, 237, 220. not going to remember that. Let's do this. We have two sites running on the same physical server with the same installation of IIS. Somebody explain back, how does this site know to render versus the other site?
Now is when it looks at a different port and a different name that you designated for it.
Which port is the core application running on?
80.
80. Which port is this application running on?
Which one did you set it to?
80.
80.
It's because you have an IP in this one, and you have a path.
The way that works is, if I have no host name, that's the default. So I just told you that you'd only have one thing talking on one port. And this looks like it's breaking the rules, right? It's not breaking the rules. What's the one thing talking on that port?
The IP address or the path?
What's the one application that owns that port? IIS. IIS. So IIS is looking at all the traffic. It is the one application. We're not breaking any rules. But IIS is saying, you know, lots of people want to talk over same port. I'm going to do some magic that will route things to your application automatically. That's how this is working. And it routes it based on bindings, which is also known as your URL. So that's how it knows, right there. And it says, if I have any requests for this thing or anything underneath it, you're going there. Everybody else goes to the default, that. What do you think is going to happen if I stop this website? Stop the one that's the default. I just did so.
This one will become the default. The server one with just the IP address no longer becomes the default because you stopped it. And then this one still is the default. Yeah.
There is no default now.
There's no default.
Yeah, because we stopped it.
But the other one works.
Oh yeah, the other one's still running.
But this is not the default. It won't automatically take you here.
How do we make it the default and named? How do you think? You know all the concepts in IIS, and I'm kind of, well, you know the highlight concepts of IIS. See all these other things? I could talk about that for about an hour or two, but those are kind of boring stuff that you probably don't need to know about.
Go to core one. You have to switch to that view, and then basic settings. And
It's not basic settings. Bindings. Good, Chris.
and you can just leave host name blank.
Isn't that where you put the IP?
We should be able to, but okay. It was just a little bug in the UI. It says, you haven't, okay, it knows, it's trying to help us. It says, you have another site defined, even though it's stopped right now. You can't run them both at the same time. Are you sure, guy, this is what you want? Yeah, I'm sure. So we have multiple bindings for the same site. So if you have an application that runs on a server, could you have multiple DNS entries that point to exactly the same code?
Yeah.
Yeah, you can have as many bindings there as you want. So if I do close and I refresh this page here, what's going to happen?
It'll go to the core one.
It's going to go to our core app because we associated the binding of the default port 80. Any questions about IIS and how it's working? And the reason I'm going over all this is because deploying your app is really, really simple. There was one missing step that Paul didn't know about, nor did I until I researched it a few days ago. The missing step is this. I'm going to paste this URL. And I don't know, well, actually, Harper and I spoke. We have a suspicion about why Microsoft's making this more complicated. What is Microsoft pushing these days? Azure. So if they're pushing Azure, are they going to make it easy for you to do this yourself? They got to make it possible, but they don't have to make it easy. So what you have to do is they don't install the, I I install this stuff, it's like, this is what works locally on Windows. There's a special one right over here, running and hosting bundle. You cannot run an ASP.NET Core web application on a Windows server by default unless you download this and install it. And then it magically works. I don't know why they don't just include that in their own operating system, like they do with Internet Explorer, say, but they didn't feel like it. So you have to download and install this. What's worse, watch what happens if we try to do that on a default Windows Server build. You'd open Windows Explorer, or Internet Explorer, excuse me. By default, it comes with hard admin. So I'm going to go over here, and right about here is where an inexperienced developer or a lazy sysadmin would give up and go to their boss and say, maybe you should just sign up for Azure. It's like, oh, wait a minute, are you sure? I'm not going to let you go there. I'm not going to let you go there. I'll let you see it, like, yeah, stop. And then I just want that. Click. What? At the very end, it says your security settings do not allow this file to be downloaded. So you go off for another 20 minutes Googling about how do I change my Internet Explorer default configuration to allow me to download stuff. You change it, it doesn't work because you have to close Internet Explorer and open it back up before it'll realize that you changed things. So it's almost like Microsoft is putting bugs in their own products for their own benefits. Go ahead.
Can you just download Chrome?
Chrome will be restricted because I believe this is an operating. You can't even download Chrome. You have the same problem.
I did that. I deleted. The first thing I did when I opened up Windows computer was download Chrome on it.
You can download Chrome if you can smuggle it on there. Here's how you can smuggle things onto your Windows computer. You can change those settings. I'm not saying it's impossible. It's just a waste of time. So, how do you smuggle things onto your instance? And this goes for Google Cloud or AWS or even Azure.
Take it from your own computer.
You download it to your local computer. Remember, see this window? We're in Remote Desktop Client. Download it locally. So you put it somewhere where you know. So usually I put it in ctemp or something. And I've deleted it. But say, let's pretend it's that Sublime build right there. So ctemp, copy the path, go to your VM instance, open Windows Explorer, open two windows to make it easier. So the way I like to think about it is the one on the left or the one on the right is the server, and the other one is going to be my local computer. The syntax is this. //, what type of path is that?
Direct, absolutely.
Three types of paths.
Server path.
No, well, you're right, but you're not saying it right. Brian said server path, but that's not a technical term. What are the three types of paths? I think we covered this on day one too.
Relative.
Relative. Relative is the one we use most often. Very good. Why do we use relative paths, by the way?
You don't have to type out the entire path.
Melissa says, so we don't have to type it all out. That's kind of a reason, but that's not a good reason.
Is it file?
Exactly right, Emma. So when we copy and paste this whole directory to another computer at a different absolute path, everything continues to work because it knows relative to all the files.
If you copy and paste it, won't it still exist in the other file and the route will still be true?
I'm talking between computers.
Oh,
Yeah, on a different computer. Usually, like from my local computer and I put it on a server, which is usually what you're doing. The paths on the server are usually different from the paths on your local computer. So, relative paths because we're developers and we want to have everything self-contained and work internally. And our absolute paths we don't want to be restricted by. So we got absolute, relative, and there's a third one. I mentioned like 30 seconds on day one. I'm surprised you don't remember that 30 seconds. It's called UNC path. That's what this is. //. It is a server path, Brian, but it's called a UNC path. So TS client is a special name that means terminal services client, which means my computer, the one currently connected. And then you don't have a colon after C. It's just a full path. You do that, and this may not work for you. Why might not this work for you? Let's do this. I told you how to do this, I believe, the first time we went around. You open remote desktop connection. By the way, what is this? How do you get there? Start run mstsc. Same thing. I happen to pin it to my taskbar, which is why I can just click on it. mstsc is what it is. So, I said more options, local resources, remember this? More drives, local C. You have to, it's not in the default permissions. Because by default, when you connect to some strange computer out there on the internet, you don't know if they have a virus that's automatically going to start talking to your drive. Since we just instantiated this VM, we're probably safe. Okay? So, if you're going to deploy things, this is the easiest way. You allow the VM session, the remote desktop session, to talk back to your local drive.
Do you want to turn that off after you deploy it up?
So Scott asked, do you want to turn that off after you deploy to a given server? I could use a pretty good metaphor here, but you were probably told growing up to be careful about who you associate with, especially intimately. The same applies for who you connect with through RDP. So it's fine to leave it. It's a setting for the entire RDP session for every future connection. Just be careful and think twice before you connect. Because when you connect, you are sharing in both directions. I usually leave it on. I just think twice before I connect. So, TS client, C temp. I usually publish everything locally. And right here, core 1. It's as simple as Control A, Control C. Go over to your core 1. Paste. Done. If I needed to change my database connection string, which is 9 times out of 10, you copy and paste appsettings.json, right? Okay. So I don't even have a database in this one because I would just test deploying. But remember that database and connection string thing? You would just come in here, change that text, and you're done. Your connection string should be appropriate to wherever your server is on the internet. Now, what is the service we learned about on AWS that allows you to host your SQL Server database? What's the name of it? DynamoDB is a relational or non-relational? It's a non-relational offering from Amazon, which is great. It's all of the disks, by the way, for DynamoDB are all SSD. So it's blazing fast, and they're really promoting, trying to get it out there, trying to become a valid database option for developers. So definitely look into it. I think Dave Peace is going to be using it for his NASCAR chat thing. Definitely good stuff, but that's not the answer to the question.
We did it the same day we set up the IIS server.
So Scott's trying to remember which day we did it on, which wasn't the answer to the question either. So SQL Server in the AWS Cloud, RDS. What does RDS stand for? Relational Database Services. There you go. So where do you find it? Let's go over here. This is the kind of thing, like 2 months from now, it's like, yeah, I know there's something in Amazon that does that. RDS. That's why people have acronyms. 3 letters is easier to remember than Relational Database Services. RDS, I don't know if we have anything running out here. Looks like we do. SQL Server. So yeah, we have a running, remember how we set this up? It's been running ever since. So in your connection string for your app, that is your server name. Endpoint. Okay? So if we were going to deploy Paul's app, the one that connected to Sakila, we have Sakila deployed here. This would be our server name. Our database name would be Sakila. Our username and password we set up when we launched this RDS instance. So we would just remember what those are. Those are all the things we need for a connection string. We would go over here in app settings, and we would enter that into the appsettings.json and save it. So this server would be able to talk over there. There's one other missing piece. What have we forgotten to do, potentially?
Get a domain?
No, we got a domain. We bought a DNS. We bought a domain. We assigned the DNS through Route 53. It's now pointing to our EC2 instance. IIS is configured to say when they ask for this route, where do we do that? That's in bindings, right over here. When they ask for this route, where do you go? Where does it go on disk? Basic settings. It goes there. And we copied and pasted from our local drive and we put it in there. So all our files are there. Then we didn't have a valid connection to our database, theoretically. We went over here. We changed it in appsettings.json. Pretend, we would put it right there. Save it. We have RDS running, so we know our endpoint's there. But Amazon, when you have security set up, does it default to on or default to off?
Or to assume off.
Assume off. Default closed. So, by default, does your EC2 instance have permission to talk to your RDS instance? No. This is where you'd be stuck for like an hour or two. It's like, what am I doing wrong? Everything looks great. It is great, but you must configure your security group. Remember, that's how security group in AWS parlance means. What is that in the real world when you're talking with a networking person?
Firewall?
A firewall. It's a software firewall. So this is where you need to go in here and say, inbound, I want to allow my EC2 instance to speak to my RDS instances. Thankfully, you don't have to do it by IP address. You can say, I want to let anybody who's in this security group to automatically have access, which is really nice. Otherwise, you'd have to list like potentially 10 IP addresses or more. So this is the name, this right here, this crazy thing. I copied and pasted. Let's go look at what I did. Where am I going to find the name of my security group associated to my EC2 instance? I know you all are thinking, is he still speaking English? Yeah. Where is that? The security group associated to our EC2 instance that's running. EC2. And we don't actually have one running, so I'm going to have to fake it. Because remember, we got it over in Google Cloud, and they do it a little bit different. But security groups, here they are. And I've got several here. Web app demo, I would just copy that, the group ID, and I would paste it right in there.
Does it automatically give you those, or like where do you?
Those are generated. Whenever you create a new security group, you'd have to go to the security groups tab, but see, here's the name. Usually you don't see that group ID.
Right.
But these are the internal IDs. The question was, are those just given to you? Yes, they are. You give it the name, and it gives you the ID.
So anything with that ID gets access to web app demo.
Web app demo is the name of a virtual firewall configuration. When you launch an EC2 instance, you can tell it, let's see. Let's do this one. There is a way to update the definition. It'd be nice if they just put it on one big screen. Networking. Okay, so we can choose which security group, which virtual firewall, or notice a checkbox, you could have multiple ones of these associated to this one instance.
So all of these are connected to firewall and are.
It has to be a firewall. Now the firewall could have nothing in it. It could just be let everybody in. But every EC2 instance has at least one security group, one firewall.
How do you know which one to use or to give access to?
Well, you create the firewall. You decide which ports to open.
Gotcha.
Normally you open only the ports that you need to open.
So that one would have been like 1413 for SQL.
Nope. Which ports would I open on a web server?
Would it have to be 80?
80 and 443. And 3306 or whatever RDP is. So I can actually remote desktop into it. Okay, let's get back to this. So I gave permission to the security group associated to my EC2 instance to my RDS security group. Remember, there's a different firewall for your RDS instance versus your EC2 instance. Just because usually your database server is going to be differently configured for permissions versus your web server. If you're a SQL server, you need to open 1433 for your database server. You don't need to open port 80. You don't need to open port 443. Is that a question or are you just stretching?
Just checking.
Okay. So, the trick with getting .NET Core to run on Windows Server, right there. Runtime and hosting bundle. You install that. How do you smuggle it over to your server?
You create two instances of the directory. So you have your server directory and then your local directory. And then you have to do the UNC type route to get to it.
So Scott is explaining the process of open Windows Explorer twice over on your, you don't have to open it twice, but it's easier to look there and here. On your server instance on the console, and you say, I'm going to copy and paste my local files from my local computer, put it on the server. You could just as easily copy and paste the installation, which is what Emma did and what almost everybody else does, because it's a huge pain to have to configure Internet Explorer to actually download a file because of the hard lockdown it comes with Windows Server. So you copy it over, you run that, you define your application in IIS. By the way, how did I get that there? Right-click, add website. It's not a big deal. Let's do it again. You know, I'm going to deploy the same site 2 times. There's nothing to it. It's just files at this point. We've had bad luck with projectors, haven't we? So this one, let's make this the default.
Can you make it the default if another one is already the default? So we would have 2 defaults now.
We won't. See, that's why it failed. It tried, and it couldn't. So we've got to change the bindings on core 1 so it's not the default. So we've got to remove that. Now it'll run. So we have core 2, just to prove it. I forget exactly where I put this, but I do have a small configuration difference. Some days I hate Windows. Come on. Seriously, you're not going to show me the extension? Watch this. It will not even show me my extensions. Give me the extensions. I'm a developer, for goodness sake. So Core 1. Save. Yes, I do. Yeah, I should have done a Linux presentation, and then I'd have so many fewer problems. Let's do this. Open is so silly. Run as administrator? Come on. Okay, the whole point of this is I can change this file, and you can distinguish between Core 1 and Core 2. That's what I'm trying to do here. Okay. Okay, all that to change a config entry. 2 different deployments of the same app. Define twice. What is an application pool? You see it right over here, basic settings, application pool. What is that? That's not one of the 80%, huh? It is the process definition for what runs, that's dedicated to running that one website. You can come over here under Application Pools, Advanced Settings, and you can identify, this is how I want you to run, like the Windows user account that I want you to run as. You can configure it about, if nobody comes and asks for anything for 20 minutes, should I go to sleep and wait for the next person to initiate something? All kinds of the little tweaks that you can do for this process. Every so often, should I reboot myself? Sure. You can configure that all by website right there. Anyway, that's beside the point. If we go to the default, first let's figure out where to put that. So I think it's contact, about. There you go. So I put it under about. So this is Core 1. It read that from our config. Need to actually know what is the IP address. 35, 237. Core 2. If we wanted to give that a nice name, because a lot of people are going to be scared to get typing in and they're going to type it wrong, I almost did IP addresses. How do you make it nice? This will be the last thing I'm going to show, and then I promise I'm going to turn it over to anybody that is ready to demonstrate, because we're going to have a throwdown between Richmond and Winston-Salem. But first, you got to make this pretty. Get rid of that IP address. Make it suitable for lay people. How do we do that, Dave?
Well, what I know to do is to go and purchase a domain name, and then you go into your AWS console and bind that name with that IP address.
Let's say we already did the first step. You're absolutely right. Thank you very much. And where do we go in our AWS console to do that?
Okay, day one. Route 53.
There you go. And we're going to go to hosted zones, and help me out. How do I do this? I've got a domain name, and if you have a domain name, you can have any number of what's called subdomains, which is a prefix on that domain. So that's how I did core app, Vote API, all that stuff. In each one of those, notice it can go to a different IP address. So, walk me through how to create, I'm going to say core2.empower2018.us. The point of this, do not be afraid of DNS. Do not be afraid of deploying another website. Do it as much as you want. These are your tools. You're that powerful now. Create a website, the drop of a hat. Go ahead.
I'm gonna guess create record set.
Great record set. We're going to call it core2.
Yeah, so under name would be core 2. And then I guess that's .empower 2018. And then, I'm trying to remember.
There's only one other entry.
Is the values where we put the IP address.
Yes. So what IP address is going to be? It's going to be the same IP address as what? Same IP address as the other core app, right?
Yes.
So where's the, you can actually see it on the left-hand side.
Maybe the same as the 35.237.220.104.
Exactly. It's this one right here. So we created a brand new subdomain. Why does this not take an hour to propagate? Because, well, it may actually. Let's do this. So core 2, we've given a nice IP address, DNS mapping. Now, is this going to work? What have we done everything we need to do?
Change the host name.
Change the host name. We have a winner. So, where do we change the host name? Do I need to go into DNS? Do I need to go into Route 53?
You need to go into your server.
I need to go into my server. What application am I going to go to on my server?
The MCFS thing we had.
No. That's MSTSC. That's this. But I'm saying this application, what is this? IIS Manager. So what do? We've got strobe light going on over here. So Richmond's going to win by default because we're going to have a stroke in a minute. So how do we change our host name?
Click on the instance, so it'd be like core 2. Now we go to basic settings instead of bindings. Nope, it was bindings. And then add, or I guess.
You could add, but let's change.
By default.
It works.
Cool. Doctor.
So,
Doctor.
do y'all feel comfortable with DNS, IIS configuration, how to deploy from your local computer, all of the C# stuff, all of the stuff you've learned, that's how you get it onto a server on the internet. And it's exactly the same process to deploy, no matter what cloud provider you use. Question?
Never mind.
Okay.
Literally just.
Yeah.